We'll start with just some basic terms. What is GDP? Why are some countries richer than others? Economic growth is another concept that we think about a lot. Then we deal with issues that are related to business cycles, like unemployment and inflation. We talk about a financial crisis, what causes a financial crisis. Is there any policy to solve them? Do we have any reason for not expecting there to be financial crises? What should the norm be expected to be? Should we expect the norm just to be smooth sailing, or should we expect fluctuations? And why? And then we'll look at inequality a little bit. Why are some people so much wealthier than others? And the first half of your first homework assignment is the discussion board post that I asked you to do, finding an article about inequality or poverty. We're writing an abstract of that article, and then also posting a PDF of that article. An abstract is a short synopsis of what the article gets at. You can put maybe at the end of the abstract your opinion, but for the most part you're supposed to be demonstrating an understanding of what was said in the article and bringing out the most important points. Okay. The rest of your homework assignment I will have posted hopefully by tomorrow afternoon sometime, and I'll give you a week to finish that. Okay, what do we have here? This is real output in terms of actual stuff made, in terms of trillions of dollars from 2005 dollars. How much stuff are we actually making? And before 1860, it's really hard to tell. Not very good statistics being kept. Why not? But remember, before 1860, the federal government wasn't the strongest government. Right? The states had more power before the Civil War. Part of the outcome of the Civil War is an increase in federal oversight and involvement. So the states lost some of their relative power then. So more national statistics start being kept, and right there at 1864, 65. So real output is growing through World War I, through the roaring 20s. We're so rich that we're going to have a recession and a depression next. Then we recover, we hit World War II. Is World War II, what do you think about what's happening there in World War II? Is that an increase in productivity or a decrease?
Increase.
An increase of measured productivity. And then a decrease following, leading into the 50s. Why?
We're at a war.
It looks to me like this is growing while we're in war. So we're increasing our productivity during war. Our measured productivity. What happens after the war?
You don't produce as much.
Recover. Women go back home. Right? Remember, during the war, women went and worked in industry while the men were fighting. And afterwards, the GIs all come home and they marry their sweethearts. Well, we have to ask the women what they thought of the men, whether they're really sweethearts or not. And they go home and there's a lot of children being born. And actually, women are discouraged from being in the workplace. There are laws put in place that make it more difficult for women to continue in work. And so measured productivity goes down, but real productivity, a lot more at-home production happening then, right? And so real productivity probably doesn't take that dip. And then we see this massive increase in output. What might we attribute to that increase in output to?
Trade.
Maybe some trade, yeah, we get past the Smoot-Hawley stuff. What else? All right, well, you got a lot more people, right? The baby boom. So total output increases. Notice this is not controlled for population. This is not a per capita demonstration of output. So population is growing. You've got more trade, you've got more people, you've got immigration occurring, lots of immigration continuing through this time period. You got a little recession in the 70s related to oil embargoes and price controls. You got a little recession in the early 80s where output decreases, a lot of unemployment during that time period. Another dip here in 1991, a little dip at the dot-com bubble bust, and then the 2007, 2009 recession related to the housing bust. In general, output has been growing by about 2% a year. This is a GDP per person. So this is per capita going from the year 1 to the year 2016. A hockey stick. Long handle, quick, short, sharp blade. This is the quality of life improvements of everyone in the world. It's occurred mostly in the last 100 to 200 years. In the last 50 years or so, even more dramatically around the world, quality of life has massively increased. GDP growth rate. So here's 0% growth. Most of the time, GDP is growing. By what? Around 2 or 3%. You see that there would be, if I put a trend through here, it'd be roughly 2 or 3%. We've got a recession here in 2008, and here we've got the 2020 situation. Okay, but mostly fluctuations, pretty stable between 0 and 5%. Some more productive years. Here's a little recession. Here's another recession. What is a recession? A recession, according to those who say whether it's a recession or not, the official, is 2 quarters or more of contraction. So this line has to be going down for 2 or more quarters. And so each dot that would be on here would be a quarter. So we see the recessions that have happened. A lot of times when you go to Fred, the Federal Reserve in St. Louis, that produces all these charts, you will see that they put gray bars where there's a recession, just so you can identify it, as if it weren't already obvious. Here's a quarterly GDP growth from 2000 to 2003. Notice we got a down quarter and up quarter, down quarter, up, down, up. Now, this time period right here, you could say that that was a U, a downward U. Like if we were taking a trend, it would look more like a longer term downward trend here, even though it's sort of up and down. So the fact that it has to be 2 quarters in a row can sometimes hide a situation where there was a bit of a recession. It becomes more obvious that there's a recession here because you've got 3 quarters going down. Looking back at 2007, there was a trend of economic growth. And in 2007, they estimated economic growth would continue along this line here. Then in 2013, they estimated that it would look like this. And part of what had happened was that making these projections at different points in time makes it more difficult to know the truth. We had this recession. Notice what happens after the recession. The trend line starts back up again at around the same slope as here, but at a lower level. So a recession can have the impact that you have a couple of quarters or longer of missed growth that are completely lost. It's not like this is curving back up and asymptotically approaching what the previous level had been expected to be. There's actual lost production during this time period and lost technological improvement and other elements that contribute to economic growth. So it's really hard to catch back up when you have a recession. Here's another graph of GDP. Okay, looking at 1950, really, really low, below $4 trillion. It hit $4 trillion for the first time in 1985. And these days we're looking at around $20 trillion. These are in 2012 dollars, so it's been corrected for inflation. Whenever you're looking at a graph like this, you got to ask yourself, right, have they corrected for inflation or not? Are we looking at a real term or a nominal term? And always be careful to make sure that if you're going to compare apples to apples, it's got to be in real terms, so it's all in the same year's dollars. How many recessions have there been since 1950? 11, give or take? If you include this one, I'm not going to include that one because it's before 1950. Here's a bunch of different countries' real GDP per capita. I'm not sure what year the base is for this. I would guess around 2010. Real GDP per capita in the United States is what, close to $40,000? What's real GDP per capita in the United Kingdom? Closer to $35,000, $30,000. This sometimes surprises students, but there is no state in the United States for which the GDP per capita is lower than the GDP per capita for the United Kingdom. Even West Virginia, or Missouri, or Mississippi, or New Mexico has a higher GDP per capita than the United Kingdom does. What else do you see? Brazil has climbed, but it sort of got stuck here, didn't it? It hasn't continued to grow as much as we had hoped. You know, Brazil gets included with Russia, India, and China as a block called the BRIC countries, BRIC countries, that have seen a lot of economic growth, but not so much lately. Here's France, the blue one. Here's Germany, the red one. Okay, so these are the three major European powers, all doing pretty well. Not far behind the United States, but we still are about slightly higher GDP per capita than them. What's the GDP per capita hiding? What do we not know from GDP per capita? What we don't see is how equitably the distribution is done in each country. So the United States has a really high GDP per capita, but you hear a lot about the 1%, don't you? They have an awful lot of that income. So if you were to take away maybe the top 5% for each country, how would the GDP per capita then compare? That might be an interesting study. I don't actually think I'll ever study and do that. Let's cut the top 5% of income earners from every country. What would the GDP per capita be for each country, setting those people aside? That might be something interesting to look into. Now I've got a new paper idea. So one puzzle is, well, why are these countries doing so differently? And what has happened in China that they've taken off since 1990? And India isn't on here, but it also has taken off since 1990. What's happened there? Why? South Korea is not on here. South Korea has taken off since the 1950s and 70s. And you think of another country that maybe has taken off. Chile has had some good times. Poland has done pretty well recently, off and on. Turkey is making some major advancements. Actually, Iran has a pretty good economy when we're not trying to crush it. Yes?
Isn't that because like these countries are adopting more of a capitalist approach, though? Isn't that the reason that they're growing?
It's a big question. There's no easy answer. There's no easy answer. We're going to look at some of the different factors that are involved there for sure. But willingness to allow for markets to fluctuate is definitely a part of it. You guys used the solo model in your intro macro course. We're going to go a little bit deeper into the solo model for this course. Did you study the solo model in your intro macro? This is real output per employed worker. So the increase in labor productivity, this does control for population growth. How productive is the average worker? And you know, 1900, the average worker in what year's dollars? In 2005 dollars, earned about $15 a day. Not necessarily earned $15 a day, but produced $15 a day of stuff. Can you live on $15 a day? So today we've got average level of productivity close to $100. Here's oil prices, inflation adjusted. And this is for a barrel of oil. And oil fluctuates wildly. What causes the price of oil to fluctuate like that? Mostly political stuff. Political stuff or hurricanes. Okay. 2020, the price of oil collapsed for a minute because futures went crazy. There was more oil in the pipelines than anybody could use, and so it was slowing things down. It was actually too much oil. Are we ever going to run out of oil? When are we going to run out of oil?
Eventually.
Well, eventually?
Not in our lifetime.
Not in our lifetimes?
Hopefully not. I mean, it's a pretty big problem. I don't know if there's anything we can do to stop it.
We ran out of oil once before. Do you remember when we ran out of oil?
I don't think I was alive.
You weren't alive. We ran out of oil once before. You know why? We ran out of whales. Most of our oil came from whales. And they got too hard to catch. And that's when they discovered that you can take that nasty black goop that's coming out of the ground on your farmland, making your farmland worthless, and instead turn it into kerosene. And all of that farmland became valuable. Right? So that's where the Beverly Hillbillies TV show came from. I saw a Bernie meme with the Beverly Hillbillies yesterday. It's perfect. Okay? Another thing that's happened since the mid-2000s is the fracking revolution. Right? that we're able to develop technologies that allow us to frack oil. We're never going to run out of oil because if we get low on oil, the price of oil will go up. And as the price of oil goes up, it creates an incentive for people to create other forms of energy or to discover or develop other forms of energy. And so sometime before we use the last drop of oil, we will find something else to do to generate electricity. Does that make sense? There's no way we're ever going to use all the oil up. It just might not be worthwhile anymore, in the same way that hunting whales isn't worthwhile anymore. Non-farm business sector, real output per hour of oil of all persons, it goes up and down, right? But we see that there is a trend of an increase in output per hour for all persons. It's interesting that they do this non-farm because one industry that has demonstrated a lot of increase in output per hour is farms. In the 1950s, you probably still have maybe 20 or 30% of people living on farms. How many people live on farms today? How many? You do, but what percentage?
I think it's 2%.
2 or 3% of all of the entire population lives or works on a farm. Okay, what do we have here? Civilian employment ratio. What percentage of the population is employed? So we get to a point in 2000 where 64% of the population is employed. Right? And then a big drop in the recession, 2008, and then it starts going back up again. But it's within a tight range here, right? Always when you're looking at a graph, make sure you look at the axes and see what range they're talking about. If we were going from 0 to 100, this would just seem like a little tiny little wave, right? But since we're going from 54 to 65, it looks more dramatic. This is also a good way to lie if you're interested, okay? So what do we see here? We see percentage of people employed. We look at women and men. The trend is, like I said, relatively tight. Notice something interesting though, right? The percentage of women in the labor force is increasing. The percentage of men in the labor force is decreasing. A lot of the jobs that were typically male professions had to do with manufacturing that, bottom line, just required muscles. A lot of those jobs are being automated. A lot of jobs that women were in were service related, and those jobs have been more difficult to automate. We do want to dig into some of these things, right? Try to understand them a little bit more, and try to see, well, does it matter for starters, and what and how? This doesn't show recently, but the opioid epidemic has hurt men again. And so you end up with a lot of people who, especially after the 2008 recession, this starts to dip. You've got a lot of discouraged workers. We also might see a general downward trend in the size of the population, the percentage of the population that is employed, because more and more of the population is old and retired. So if a greater share of the population is old and retired, then we ought to see a smaller share of the total population being employed. Also, people are having fewer children. So here's the unemployment rate from 1890 on. So notice there was a big recession in 1890. How many of you know anything about that recession? Me neither. Not really, not a lot. Okay, I don't know much about what happened then. It'd be something interesting maybe to look into. Then we have the Great Depression. Then World War II comes in, and unemployment goes down. A couple of things to notice. During the Great Depression, a couple of government programs were put into place that employed people who were unemployed. However, because they were government programs, those people continued to be counted as unemployed. Whereas once they went to war, being a soldier, they were counted as employed then. But in both cases, they were working for the government. So there's some funny stuff happening with these numbers, okay? That's all I'm trying to say. But there were people who had work. It was just, New Deal kinds of jobs that didn't get counted. We've never had it quite so bad as then, right? Well, this right here is 2020. Okay, and unemployment hit, close to 15 higher percent. It just took off. with the pandemic, and we wanted it to, right? This is what we wanted to have happen. We wanted everybody to go home and sit on your hands for a little while, all right, to try to get this thing to pass. Since then, we paid them to stay home. Since then, the unemployment rate has fallen again. Here's the consumer price index. So this is inflation, a measure of inflation, or the general price level. Notice there's hardly any inflation from 1800 to 1940, 1960. Why not? Why is inflation mostly under control during that time period? And why are the only blips wars? Well, the only time that the federal government allowed the printing of extra money was during the war to finance the war. But very quickly, they had to pay those dollars back. Why? Well, because they were all backed by gold. We were under the gold standard. Actually, all the way up until 1970 or so. In other words, on your money, it literally said, redeemable for gold or silver. And you could take it to a bank and they would give you gold or silver for it. At a certain point, the government said, all your gold belong to us, and you can't have it. And so they took all the gold and silver and confiscated it for themselves and issued fiat currency money. Is that a problem? It's only a problem if some of us don't agree to use it, or if they increase the quantity supply of money in an unpredictable manner. We'll cover that when we talk more about inflation. Here's the inflation rate over time from 1965 until 2015. Inflation rate got pretty high in the early 80s until Paul Volcker entered in and said, no more of that. And when he did that, there was a big recession in the United States. It was actually a monetary recession that's related to what's called a stagflation episode that came out of the 1970s. Change in U.S. unemployment and inflation. So there's this idea that unemployment and inflation are closely related. That goes back to the Phillips curve. We're going to investigate that a little bit more. Not a lot. The Phillips curve is largely debunked at this point, but we might look at it a little bit more. What's this? Oh, we've got United States national debt. Since 2012, has gone from $15 trillion to about $25 trillion. So in the course of the last 10 years, we've almost doubled the national debt. And now we are at a point where the national debt is greater than the annual GDP for our country. So if everything that we produced this year went to pay for the debt, we wouldn't be able to pay it off. Now, how many of you know somebody who owns a house? And maybe their house costs more than their annual income. Is that a problem? Not really. You get a 30-year mortgage. You're not expected to pay it all in 1 year, are you? So it's not necessarily a problem, but this is a concern to many people. We want to wash away any of the romance or fear involved in understanding of that so we can understand it more clearly. There is a place online where you can look at, the national debt at the moment. I mean, it's a national debt clock. COVID stimulus, of course, has added another $1.5 trillion of national debt. I wonder who's willing to pay for it? I wonder who's willing to buy that debt? I guess people who believe in America or believe in the global economy are willing to take a bet on all of that. Okay. Here's my number. 23. So again, this is debt as compared to GDP. We had been paying the debt down for a while, especially after World War II. We paid the debt down. Got down to like 20% of GDP. And then 2000, you've got the Middle East war stuff happening, then the recession, there was a lot of debt issued, and then new debt. what do we have here? This is, government spending as compared to taxes. So the black line is taxes, the red line is the government spending. Now, it used to be thought that the government should run a balanced budget. That was the case until the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes provided an argument why the government might want to run a deficit during recessions. And his idea was that during an expansionary period, you would pay that debt down. Interestingly, no politician ever has an incentive to pay the debt down, because that would require raising taxes. And so the political economy of paying down the debt makes it very difficult for it to actually happen. So the debt just grows. Oh, imports and exports. So the black line is exports, the red line is imports. The United States was a net exporter from around 1890 until roughly, still an relative exporter until we hit, really 1980, 1990. We exported more than we imported. Now we import more than we export. We have a trade deficit. Is that a problem? It's hard to say. Although a lot of people try to point to it as a problem. They think it's bad. I don't know why it necessarily should be bad. It's important to think about trade as not being trade between countries, but as being trade between individuals in those different countries. And as long as those individuals are happy to trade with each other, who is anybody else to say that they shouldn't? Why does an arbitrary line drawn across some territory so relevant to whether or not we should buy or sell from people? Unless maybe you're just very, very nationalistic. But even then, it doesn't necessarily make sense. So here's the balance of trade, monthly, in thousands. So, more is being imported than being exported. By the way, I went to the port in Long Beach when I was in California a couple weeks ago. It was a glorious thing. So beautiful. Container ships as far as I could see, and containers all over the place. Just these containers full of stuff being imported. They keep on sending us stuff, and we send them green pieces of paper, and then they send us more stuff, and we send them green pieces of paper, and we're swimming in stuff. It's glorious. I don't know why people are upset by it. This chart describes gross domestic product as being broken down between different kinds of elements. So if I can zoom in a little bit here, what kinds of things are included in GDP? There's personal consumption, capital letter C. That can be broken down into durable goods and non-durable goods and services. There's investment, capital letter I. There's investment in non-residential structures and equipment and intellectual property. So you've got warehouses and factories. You've got machinery. It's interesting how big IP is relative to structures. The most important property, it would seem, is actually what's between our ears. Yes?
Can we find the specific chart on the Fred database?
You should be able to find this on the Fred database.
Okay, thank you.
Or at least to generate it, which would be a good project. Then there's houses, people's residential stuff, and then private inventories. The amount of stuff that has been produced but hasn't been sold yet. We want to count how much has been produced every year. And so here we have a year where more has been produced than sold. What happens the next year? Oh, we sell some of it. Or the next quarter. It's not always balancing out, but sometimes it is. What happens if you make something and you don't sell it, and then you never sell it? Well, eventually it wears out and rusts. And if it's a tomato, it goes bad. And then you have net exports and services. Notice imports, exports on net is negative through all of these time periods. So you've got C, I, this is called NX, net exports. Exports are less than imports. Okay. It might be interesting to disaggregate that between goods and services. Notice we are a net exporter of services relative to other countries. So we're becoming a service-based economy. And then G. And there's both federal and state and local government. Notice something. Which is bigger? Federal government expenditures or state and local expenditures? State and local, do we usually think about state and local expenditures when we're talking about macro? Not so much. Usually we focus on the federal part. We often forget how big a chunk of our taxes really are paid locally. They're spent at the state and local level. Most amenities that make our lives better off are provided at the state and local level. Most of the money that goes to pay for public education is collected at the state level or the community level. Most of the money that goes to pay for roads is done at the state level. Most of the amenities that we actually make use of are provided at the local level. National defense is the biggest chunk of federal spending. When's the last time you used a B-52? Last time I went to the glove shack, that's when, baby. I don't know where these come from. Okay, unemployment is low. After the tax cuts went into effect, unemployment was falling. But then we had the recession, or the pandemic. Consumer spending has been growing faster than income. Well, that's a problem. If consumer spending is growing faster than disposable income, what's happening? We're going more and more into debt, right? Are consumers holding more debt than in the past? What might lead to consumers holding more debt?
Credit cards.
Credit cards, but there have been credit cards for a while. How about lower interest rates? If interest rates are lower, that might make people more willing to borrow more. An interest rate is the time price of money. The lower the interest rate, the more you are willing to borrow. Total corporate profits jumped sharply in the first quarter of 2018. In 2018, corporate profits jumped. Again, that may be related to tax policies. Do you think? It really started taking off in 2016. Here's personal consumption expenditures. How much money are people spending on consumer goods? Around $14.5 trillion. Domestic investment. So we're taking apart that CIGNX. When we talk about macro policy, we think about GDP as being composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. We're looking at each piece here. So here's investment. Notice the recession, people just dropped their investments, or maybe the value of their investments dropped. But I think that this is more like people stopped investing for a minute. Yes.
Now, does this include financial institutions, such as like brokerage firms and whatnot, or is this just like personal investors?
This includes all corporate investment, I think, but it may be that this is a measure of investment in real assets.
So like real
So
estate.
not
and
necessarily
stuff.
financial assets. I don't
Okay.
know. That'd be an interesting question.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good question to ask. I don't know the answer.